We have Matthew Nordan. He was a venture capital investor at Venrock, one of the oldest and most successful VCs, where he backed companies like Nest Labs, later acquired by Google. He co-founded the Prime Coalition and is now managing director for the Prime Impact Fund. In addition to serving on multiple boards, he is co-founder and managing partner of MNL Partners, developing energy and environment projects and global markets. Please help me welcome Matthew Nordan, who is going to share with us Fighting Climate Change with Innovation, a Prime Coalition case study.
Hey, everybody. Okay, so we're going to wrap up the day with something that I think at the very least is going to be different than what you've heard before. I want to talk to you about a truly new model for funding breakthrough innovation for climate. I want to tell you my personal story about how I came, of all things, to be working on this, and then give you a case study of what it looks like in action. I came to a realization about a decade ago that there is a secret formula that drives the world. It's all around us, like the Matrix around Neo. And it's three numbers that multiply together. First number is people. You know how long it took to get the first billion people? About 200,000 years. We got the next billion in 130, next billion in 30. We now get another billion people about every 13, 14 years. Second number is stuff per person. If you're an economist, you would call this GDP per head. For their sins, there are people who have tracked this all the way back to 0 AD, and as you can see, not much happened until Columbus crossed the Atlantic, and then that number went up in a geometric progression that has never stopped. The third number is resources per unit of stuff, or the resource intensity of GDP. And the best case for me with this is China. It shows you what happens when a bunch of people get rich at the same time. Between 2000 and 2005 in China, GDP per person went up by 60, 70%, an astonishing number. But oil per person for transportation went up by 400%. So every unit of wealth brought maybe 8 units of oil in its wake. You multiply these things together, people times stuff per person times resources per unit of stuff, the terms cancel, and you get a vertical wall of resources, where we need more of everything, more fuel, more food, more water, more critical materials, and all of that just means more energy. Because energy is the lowest common denominator of any other resource, right? If you had infinite clean energy, you would not care about liquid fuels. You would just reconfigure the molecules in a plant to make something that you could run a combustion engine car on. You wouldn't care about desalination per se. You would just thermally evaporate the oceans. So the question for us as a society is where we will get conflict and carbon-free energy that can power a more populous and more prosperous world. Now, I thought in 2009 that I was going to do that within the system of venture capital, right? The system that funds technology companies in our country. I joined a firm called Venrock that I was recruited into, that is arguably the oldest venture capital firm, originally the venture arm of the Rockefeller family, and brought you names like Boeing and Intel and Apple. My colleagues and I invested in 9 energy tech companies. The biggest hit that I had was Nest, a smart home company. First product was a smart thermostat. Roller coaster ride, formed in 2010, shipped product a year later, had saved 1 billion kilowatt hours of energy. 2 years after that, does that sound like a lot? It's not. 1 year later, it was bought by Google for $3.2 billion, the largest venture capital-backed outcome in this space, 2 times the size of Tesla's market cap at IPO. What burned me in the heart every Monday morning was that this doesn't matter. Like, it matters from an entrepreneurial perspective. It matters from a financial one. But when it comes to offsetting a 2 degrees Celsius climate temperature rise, it doesn't matter at all. It just nibbles around the edges of electricity consumption in the developed world. I knew one very specific morning that I was not going to accomplish my goals within the system. It's this revolution versus reform question. And it was a Monday morning partner meeting that I was in New York for. And it was a rare Monday morning because normally we had just one company come in and pitch to the whole partnership at the end of the investment process. This morning we had 2. The first company I won't belabor, a hard technology company in my space, awesome young founders, gold-plated angel investment, oversubscribed Kickstarter out of Y Combinator. They got done with their pitch, they left the room, the general partners debated and said, you know, our whole industry is kind of going in a more Instagram, Snapchat direction. And that's what our next fund is going to do, and we don't want the last few investments in this fund to look different than what we're going to market. So we're going to pass. Not going to invest in this company. Then the second company came in. Two British founders who had made an iPhone app targeted at sorority girls at party schools to rate guys on dimensions including their anatomy. It's good to laugh. They got done and left the room. The GPs debated and said, we need to do the entire $10 million Series A at a $40 million valuation because this is a must-do, and they cannot leave New York without a term sheet. So I walked out of that room and went into a conference room. I made 2 phone calls. The first was to my wife, and I told her, I am done. There is nothing for me here. It was like that Seinfeld scene in Costanza where he's up from the table. Game over. The second call was to my co-founder at Prime Coalition, a brilliant young woman who had led a charity, the Tusonis Foundation, before doing her thesis work at MIT. Her name is Sarah Carney. And Sarah, not 2 weeks beforehand, had sat across a table from me in my office and said, Matthew, you and I both believe there needs to be a different capital source to bring true breakthrough climate technologies into the world, one that has a lower opportunity cost than investment capital. You don't have the answer, she said, but I do. There's $600 billion that sits in US family foundations alone. That's 4 times bigger than the entire venture capital asset class, of which $50 billion goes out in grants every year. And many of these foundations have climate change, environmental preservation, global equity, human health as part of their missions, and they have special investment tools available only to them called program-related investments and recoverable grants that allow you to count a dollar like a grant, goes out, counts to the money you got to give away. If money comes back, it comes back in tax-free. But it can make an investment in convertible debt or equity, for example, in a breakthrough technology startup company. And I looked at that and a light went off in my head. I realized the reason that I had been passing, and Sequoia had been passing, and Kleiner Perkins had been passing on breakthrough energy tech companies was that they were just a little too early and a little too risky compared with the alternative use of the same dollar, compared with an 8% market return. But if the opportunity cost of the dollar was a grant, a dollar that would never come back, you now just had a completely different lens through which to view risk and reward. If you backed a whole bunch of breakthrough technology companies, you didn't get your asymmetric financial win. You got 80 cents back on the dollar. You're now not a bad investor. You're a brilliant philanthropist. Someone gave you a magic wand that enabled you to grant $1 and put it to work 1.8 times. That is what we set up Prime Coalition as a 501c3 nonprofit at the bleeding edge of impact investing, with one strand of DNA that's philanthropic giving and one strand that is hard-nosed venture capital, to do in 2015. We empower philanthropists to place charitable capital, money that would have otherwise been granted, into for-profit startups that are pursuing market-based solutions to climate change. They're not things venture investors would back. They're a little too early, a little too risky, but they need to be brought into the world with a de-risked source of capital, and that's what we do. We have formed a network that has on one side philanthropic individuals and foundations that believe that climate change is real and technology is something that you can pull to do about it and want to put their dollars to work in a different way. On the other side, we have breakthrough tech companies that can make a difference at a planetary scale in a meaningful time frame when it comes to energy and climate. We've now backed 7 of these companies. I won't go through them in detail. They all share in common 3 things that are the 3 steps in our selection process. Number 1, can it be a big difference, not a small one, when it comes to climate? Our mark is, could you offset with deployment of this company's technology at scale a gigaton of CO2 equivalent emissions or more by 2050 per year? Now, for context, all wind ever built is a little over 1 gigaton COE2e per year, so we only care about really big things. Second criterion is fitness for charitability. Would it be funded anyway? The software companies are out. Services companies are out. We primarily focus on hard tech propositions that have high risk and long time frames. And then third, if we can de-risk with philanthropic capital early, will it be attractive to follow-on investors? will we connect the company to the normal financial system versus launching it into a void? By sector, our portfolio doesn't seem to have anything associated with it because there are many routes to emissions. But our thermal antenna company, RedWave, creates an antenna that allows you to tune low temperature waste heat, what comes out of a car exhaust or a cooling tower, into electricity the same way that your car's stereo tunes radio waves into sound. Our desalination company, Anfiro, is decreasing the energy content of desalination by 10x at the membrane, allowing you to radically lower the cost of reverse osmosis and scale it down for homes and businesses. Opus 12, our most recent investment, is taking air capture of atmospheric CO2 and using that as a feedstock in an electrolysis cell to convert it into high-value fuels and chemicals. We've now mobilized $17 million just in the last 2 years. We have had 52 different foundations and individual philanthropists participate in our investments. And we're pretty confident that we're actually moving new money versus putting old wine in new bottles, because 28 of those philanthropic investors had never done a program-related investment or a recoverable grant before they met us, and 17 of them, not overlapping, had never done anything at all, including a traditional grant in energy and climate. I mentioned beforehand that we have a pretty rigorous selection process. How do we do that? Well, we start by trying to assess everything. We'll miss some stuff, but we create a registry that should have all seed, Series A, and Series B stage tech startups in the US in energy, ag, waste, and water. Our selection process last year started with 2,389 startups. And then we have an investment advisory committee, these 11 folks you see, plus myself as chair, who do the assessment I talked about beforehand. It's relying on them that we can determine, would this have gotten funded anyway? They have to say no. And would normal capital follow on if it's de-risked? They have to say yes. And these are the right people. Tom Bagala sits on Bill Gates's personal energy tech boards. Marianne Wu runs the energy activity at General Electric's venture arm. Nancy Fund at DBL has the only Elon Musk three-peat, having backed Tesla, SolarCity, and SpaceX in succession. But the question is, how does all this come together? What happens when you take badass, visionary philanthropic investors and get them to back a proposition that everybody agrees somebody should fund, just not me, just not now, and that otherwise would have died on the vine before it could be de-risked? Well, let me tell you about one, and then I'll close out. So in 2012, after a few years at Venrock, I was very focused on the problem of grid-scale energy storage. How do we time shift solar and wind so that they can be baseload, dispatchable resources, can compete fully with fossil-fired fuels, fossil-fired power, without subsidy, without any kind of price support or other kind of crutch? One of the conclusions that came out of that, not only for myself but for other venture investors, is that batteries might be hard to do at true grid scale. Because the inactive materials in a battery, things that aren't the lithium or the graphite, might be so high cost they can't compete with peaking natural gas generation at scale. So you'd like to have something else. One day that something else walked in the door. It was a technical founder named Howard Schmidt, at the time at Saudi Aramco, who had a company called QuidNet. And his proposal was to subvert the learnings that we have from 40 years of fracking, which is a bad thing, does not help us decrease emissions in a material way, and use it to store renewable power in the form of pressurized water in underground geologic reservoirs. Why would you do that? You would have almost no energy-related cost, only power-related cost. And at about $60 a kilowatt hour or less all in, you could compete with peaking natural gas generation, even at $5 a million BTU. I passed on this. Everyone else on Sand Hill Road passed on this. Why? Because all the work had been done in computational models, and the first use of funds would be to go out into some site in oil country and bring out a rig and pressurize a reservoir. And if you picked the wrong one, you could blow $1 million like between 9 and 10 a.m. And no one wanted to fund that. Everyone just wanted to come back after it had been done once. This became Prime's first investment after VCs turned it down. We did a first seed round at the end of 2015. 4 impact investors, 2 individuals, the Sorensen Impact Foundation in Utah, which is very well known in this field, and then the Will and Jada Smith Foundation, as in the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, in their one and only entree into clean energy. They've done this with Prime. We also, in addition to that $500K, had in-kind services from Halliburton, who did our field work for free. If that sounds like being part of the Rebel Alliance with your good friend Darth Vader, you are correct. We went out to a site in Erath County, Texas, where, from what I can tell, there is cattle and meth labs. We pressurized a reservoir. It did not crack open. We then did a second seed round. Oh, by the way, and the data was extraordinary. The board meeting afterward was awesome. One of these rare cases where you get an upside surprise on every figure of merit you're trying to test. We did a second seed round. Now one impact investor, Sorensen, joined by Clean Energy Venture Group. Again, Halliburton doing in-kind services. Over 9 months, so almost a year's worth of seasonality, we did 47 serial pressurizations and repressurizations of that reservoir, testing its integrity for the earth to act like a spring in a repeatable way. They correlated almost perfectly, 0.99 R squared. We then raised in 2017 a third seed round, 2 impact investors from Prime and Clean Energy Venture Group, to prepare the company to be a real company. We brought on a CEO, Joe Zhou, who's a veteran energy storage executive, finalized our techno-economic model, secured offtake for the power from a first plant from Texas United Co-op, and supporting project finance. Those discussions are underway with a number of parties, including NextEra. And I'm pleased to report that 6 months ahead of schedule, Joe raised a Series A round of $7.5 million. It closed last month, led by Breakthrough Energy Ventures, the long-term energy tech fund of Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Jack Ma, and 17 other billionaires, and Evoke Innovations, a Canadian strategic-backed fund. The use of that capital is to build what will be a 125 megawatt hour first commercial facility in Central Texas. It is on the same scale as the large lithium-ion battery that Tesla built in Australia, whose cost analyst estimates, depending on who you believe, put between $60 and $90 million. Our target for the same capacity is 9. That's what we're doing at Prime. I invite you to join us. This is a model for de-risking real climate breakthroughs that depends on an immense amount of philanthropic capital that is out there and redirecting basis points of it in a different direction that is pro-climate, pro-innovation, and pro-entrepreneur. I hope to speak with more of you at the drinks, and I'll be around tomorrow. Thanks.